The dire emergency in East Africa, the drought there exacerbating the hunger crisis. As many as 20 million people could be starving by the middle of this year, half of them children.
Now, when we talk about already vulnerable regions becoming more vulnerable and fragile because of how extreme poverty will rise.
A large number of South Africans live in extreme poverty, with the situation so dire that some can't even pay for basic nutritional requirements.
In the year 2020, when the global pandemic COVID-19 hit the shores of every country around the world, Africa was the region that experienced the hardest hit. According to reports, 30 million more Africans fell into extreme poverty during the global crisis. Falling under the poverty lines here means living under less than $1.90 per day. The imbalance of the capitalist world is one of the main reasons behind this poor situation in some of the African nations. But the pandemic alone is not guilty of making so many people go below the poverty lines in Africa after 2020. Before COVID-19, more than 445 million people in Africa lived below the poverty line. These 445 million people make up around 34% of the African population. Adding 30 million more, 475 million people are now living under the poverty line in this region. The level of poverty is so high in this region that Africa has 9 times more poor people compared to the rest of the world. This is a major concern for not only humanity but also for the future of the region itself. In the year 2015, the United Nations started implementing a plan for sustainable development goals to ensure peace and prosperity around the world. More specifically, this plan was developed to improve the standard of living in the poor regions of the planet. And a large number of these targets were based in the African region. The UN selected 17 SDG goals with a large number of targets of 169. The member countries who joined this plan agreed to remove poverty, hunger, inequality, and illiteracy from the member countries by the year 2030. In the year 2023, the new SDG plan for removing poverty from the world will be halfway. And, by this period, the challenge of removing poverty has become harder after the global pandemic struck the world. With the plan approaching its halfway, the region is not likely to meet SDG 1, which is to remove poverty from 97% of the African population. 23 out of the 28 poorest countries in the world are in Africa, and currently, the extreme poverty rate in this region stands at more than 35%. Though this mark was less than 35% before the pandemic, now it has crossed it. If we take numbers into our calculations, Africa has gone 40 years behind the situation of the world in 1981. In 1981, the overall poverty level around the world was 42.8%. If we take the extreme poverty line of $1.90 per day, Africa has an extreme poverty rate of 43.1%, which is greater than the world poverty rate in 1981. Conditions have worsened in Africa in the last 30 to 40 years. During 1990, China, Vietnam, and Indonesia had comparable rates of poverty with African nations like Lesotho, Nigeria, and Zambia. While China has become the most powerful economy in the world with a GDP of $21,643.25 billion in the year 2023, Africans are still fighting against poverty. Also, Indonesia and Vietnam have recovered from the damages they faced in the last century. Both these countries have significantly improved during the last few decades. But the condition of Africa is still poor. If we look at the map of Africa, the sub-Saharan region is the most poverty-concentrated one within the whole continent. The poverty rate in Central Africa is more than 50% currently. According to reports, Central Africa has a poverty rate of 54.8% in 2022. After that, Southern Africa is the region with the most poverty. The region has an estimated level of 45% poverty by 2022. Compared to Central and Southern Africa, the situation is better in the eastern and western parts of the region. The extreme poverty rate in Eastern Africa is only 33.8%, which is the lowest among the countries of the continent. On the other hand, Western Africa has an extreme poverty rate of 36.8%, while the most developed part of Africa is North Africa with a poverty rate below 3% in 2019. Though, this region has also faced immense challenges during the COVID-19 crisis. There are 54 countries in Africa, and the difference among the 5 parts of Africa shows how the region has suffered in some specific places massively in recent years. While the SDG plan was taken in 2015, the plans didn't work well till the pandemic too. While some researchers blame the COVID-19 pandemic as a major reason why poverty is still on the rise in Africa, some suggest that the region has been struggling to meet the SDG goals due to political unrest and corruption. We cannot skip their words if we look into statistics. Just before the pandemic in 2020, in the year 2019, South Sudan was the poorest African country with a poverty rate of more than 78%. Also, 10 African countries out of 54 had extreme poverty in 2019. Burundi, Madagascar, and the Central African Republic also had a poverty rate of more than 70% before the pandemic. So, we can not only blame the pandemic for such a poor situation. While some of the African governments are still trying to hide the actual situation, it's not much good. And, political unrest in these countries is one of the main reasons why they are not moving at a similar pace to the rest of Africa. Though there are some positives too. Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia are among the countries that have been developing rapidly in recent years. Before the epidemic, these countries took their poverty level below 1%. Strong political structure and proper utilization of resources have led to the success of these countries from a global point of view. If we take Morocco as an example, the country has focused on 3 major sectors to improve faster than the rest of Africa. They are 1. Renewable energy, 2. Automotive industry, 3. Aeronautics industry. The country has also improved its textile, food processing, pharmaceutical industry, offshoring industry, and mining industry in recent years. Gradual industrialization, good governance, and lowering corruption have led to the success of Morocco. Not only Morocco but also, Egypt has also met its target of SDG in recent years. But if we look into the negatives, it is quite higher than the positives. There are a lot of factors that are influencing Africa's inability to remove extreme poverty from all the regions. One of the major factors that have always restricted Africa from growth is the overdependence on natural resources, rather than agricultural and rural development. The region is dependent on natural resources largely. While agricultural development works as the root of all developments, Africa has never progressed much in terms of agriculture. The harsh environment of the region is another reason behind this. 85% of the African population is dependent on the rural side, where not much progress has taken place over the years. Poor governance is another reason why African countries are failing the battle against extreme poverty. The majority of Africans don't have access to public services, which makes it harder for people to grow economically. The corrupted governance and high income inequality are making it harder for poor Africans to come out of poverty. Also, the high rate of population growth is not helping the African economy to grow. By the year 2030, it is estimated that around 479 million people will live in extreme poverty, which will be almost 28.1% of the African population. Also, Central Africa will continue to be the poorest side of Africa, where 44.6% of the people will be living under the extreme poverty line by the year 2030. On the other hand, the North African region will only have a 1.8% extreme poverty rate, as the region is continuously progressing. By the year 2030, the extreme poverty rate of all the countries in Africa will see a decline, and 9 countries will be able to meet the SDG target by the year 2030. Over the years, Africa has suffered because of not utilizing its natural resources due to the aggressive measures of Western investors. Also, the corruption of its leaders is a big reason. Taking over the natural energy resources and utilizing them for regional benefits is very significant for Africa to improve gradually. The way Middle Eastern countries like Qatar, Saudi, and UAE have utilized their resources for regional growth, Africa shall also focus on taking control over natural resources. However, the question here is, will Africa be able to come out of this poor condition ever? The simple question is, yes. You have to always remember that Africa is one of the richest regions in the world in terms of natural resources. The only way to come out of this bad condition is to restructure the continent with powerful leadership. If the continent can restructure its governance with dedicated leaders, it will take some decades to change the conditions. The first thing Africa needs to grow is the manufacturing sector. If we take the example of China, the country has become one of the major players in global geopolitics due to its heavy influence on global trade. While Africa saw its fastest ever growth in the export of manufactured goods in the last decade, it only had a share of 3% of global exports. On the other hand, China alone took 12.4% market share of global trade between the years 2011 to 2020. Without investment in manufacturing, it will be a challenge for Africa to have better control over the flow of money to the region. Increased focus on manufacturing and training human resources for increased productivity is a huge necessity for Africa. As mentioned previously, Africa is the richest continent on Earth in terms of natural resources. But there is another sector where Africa has great potential. That is the human resources sector. Currently, there are more than 1.4 billion people in the region. The countries of Africa have to take immediate measures for training the unused human resources to increase their level of manufacturing. 50% of the Africans are youth, and this immense number of youths can change the continent forever if they are trained properly for increased manufacturing in the region. Some might argue that Africa doesn't have the economic resources that China had for increased investment efforts. But one inspiring fact is, you will survive in the global market if you can utilize the human resources available to the country. While a large population is a curse for some, it happens to be the driver of the economic force of many underdeveloped countries. A good example of this is the South Asian nation, Bangladesh. The country has done immensely well by only focusing on two factors. They are the clothing manufacturing industry and remittance. The textile industry holds 28.1% and remittance holds 6.03% of the Bangladeshi GDP. The small country from South Asia has utilized its human resources to develop one of the largest clothes manufacturing industries in the world, and it has created a chain of relationships with developed countries for sending migrant workers every year, which brings remittance for the country. During COVID-19, when the world was suffering, the textile industry and the remittance from migrant workers were the two key factors that made the country survive the crisis. If Africans can take over what is their own and improve its vast human resources, they will have enough resources to create a manufacturing industry-based continent. Joint efforts from the regional powers of Africa are needed for success. You never know, a united Africa can take over the West in the future.